I was a young child when I was first introduced to Lesotho. I read a lot of dinosaur books, and one of those dinosaurs was the small Jurassic ornithischian Lesothosaurus. The dinosaur videotape pronounced it that way. The country is pronounced Lesotho. It has to do with the way the Sesotho language decides to spell its words. But didn't we already talk about how Lesotho got its borders? Yeah, 1869. Remember the Orange Free State and King Moshoeshoe I agreed to their border, right? But we should probably give this little mountain country its due diligence. The Kingdom of Lesotho is located on the same central plateau that dominates South Africa. I made a little bit of a mistake last video. Get used to that. I showed Lesotho as part of the High Veld. While most of its people live on it, most of the country itself is dominated by the Lesotho highlands. When that ancient magma plume thrust southern Africa upwards in the Jurassic some 180 million years ago, lava seeped through the cracks in the earth like a great oozy scab, creating a thick layer of basalt rock. Over time, erosion wore away most of the top layers of rock, forming a giant bowl that slopes to the northwest. Oodles of canyons, gorges, and valleys were carved, creating the Drakensberg. What remains of the basalt became the Lesotho Highlands. Lesotho is cut entirely by the Orange River and its tributaries, called the Senqu in Sesotho, the Black River. Lesotho is the only country in the world entirely at least 1,000 meters, 3,281 feet, above sea level. In fact, 80% is at least 2,000 meters, 5,906 feet, giving it that crisp mountain air. This means, despite being in the subtropics, in Africa, Lesotho's climate is temperate, sometimes chilly. The wet season is summer, in the southern hemisphere December to February, mostly falling in thunderstorms. But snow regularly falls in winter, sometimes year-round in the mountains. Lesotho is basically real-life Jabari land in Wakanda. We have about 200 countries to get through on planet Earth, and that kind of workload demands some economies. This series is structured to build off each episode, and we already talked about the first southern Africans, the San Bushmen, the Kwekwe cattlemen of the veldt, and then the Bantu peoples come from the north. Those were the ancestors of the Basotho. The veldt Bantu diverged into a distinct Sotho people. The name may have come from an old derogatory Swazi word, Akbashuntu, those who tie knots, referring to the barbarous loincloths of the Sotho. Or maybe it came from the phrase, Ba Su'utu, they are brown. Whichever the case, the Sotho came to embrace the term as a sign of their heritage. Bantu grammar is funky compared to European languages. The terminology settled on Musutu in the singular, Basutu in the plural. Shaka Zulu does his Mifikane, which the Sotho call the Difakane, the crushing, the scattering, and many Bantu clans flee in the wake of the conquests. The Bomokoteli were one such clan of Sotho, led by Chief Moshoeshoe. He relocated to a plateau stronghold south of the Caledon River, called the Mohokake in Lesotho. Here, Moshoeshoe resisted the Zulu and gathered other clans until, in 1822, he managed to become king of Lesotho, land of the Basotho. The term king is interesting. The Sesotho word is Murena, he who rules. The English king comes from the Old English König, meaning a noble's child. In the European usage, king evolved in the Middle Ages as a title of sovereignty, a title bestowed by God himself. It also carried an ethnic sense. The one English people could have many lords, barons, and earls, but only one king. I bring this up because titles in the languages they are bestowed in come with particular cultural and political connotations for the people who bestow them. King and emperor are very common translations in English for many titles around the world that try to approximate the history those institutions represent. There is a theory of history, a progression of societies, from hunter-gatherer bands to simple farming communities led by a chief, to the accretion of chiefdoms under a paramount chief, to the emergence of true states under kings. This model was formulated in the 20th century and puts forth a specific view of anthropology that can be construed as Eurasia-centric, as the states of Eurasia have the most historical data to draw on, and the point when a chieftain becomes a kingdom depends on who you're asking. There were many African rulers who are called king, or paramount chief, depending on the time, place, and who's doing the naming. Paramount chief is a term the British used for their client rulers, perhaps so as to not compare these quaint native folk to His Royal Majesty by the grace of God, the King. If authorities, authors, historians, etc., are impressed with a chieftain's accomplishments, they might deign to call him king. Moshoeshoe was definitely a mighty figure in his time, and I will dignify him as King Moshoeshoe I, and he earned that by his battles with the Griqua, if you remember those Dutch-speaking frontier coloreds from the Cape. He managed to accrue a large amount of guns and horses from the Griqua, becoming the most powerful Sotho ruler on the veldt. As such, the term Basutu settled on his people, likely because when people spoke of the mighty Basutu, they meant Moshoeshoe's boys. He was also a capable diplomat, and in 1843 allied with the British Cape Colony. The British really didn't like their subjects, the Voortrekkers, escaping into the interior, and the British gave the king money and supplies to stop the Boers. Of course, in 1848, with the Orange River sovereignty, the British claimed Lesotho north of the Orange River, which included most of his people's settlements. Moshoeshoe also invited Christian missionaries, steadily converting the population. This was a bid to modernize Lesotho, but friction with the British led to a conflict. The Basutu held them off, and the British finally withdrew in 1854, allowing the Boer Orange Free State to take over. Unfortunately, 3 wars against the Boers led to Basutu defeat. Moshoeshoe appealed to the British in 1867, and the British first approved annexing Lesotho into the Natal colony, but the governor of Cape Colony and High Commissioner for Southern Africa, the man charged with overseeing British affairs at the bottom of the continent, refused, and instead made Lesotho a British protectorate. A protectorate was an arrangement where a local country agreed to let Britain handle its foreign policy while it maintained control over internal affairs. A commissioner would be appointed to ensure everything was running smoothly. This was how it worked on paper, but often the commissioner would begin acting like a governor of a colony. Moshoeshoe managed to preserve his kingdom, but was forced to cede territory to the Boers. Pre-modern borders are often ill-defined, usually settlements and the surrounding farms and woods. Maybe a river or mountain range divided 2 places, but usually there were few markers between 2 cities and the wilderness between them. But modern states required modern administrations and maps, and that meant borders needed to be defined. In 1869, Lesotho and the Orange Free State formalized their border. The southwestern border was the small Tele River, down to the Orange, down until the Makaleng or Gornetsprut, then along some ridges until the Caledon, and up it to the edge of the Drakensberg, which formed the southern boundary with the British Cape and Natal colonies and the Xhosa Kingdom. Those lands between the Orange and Caledon west of the boundary were claimed and conquered by the Boers for their fertility, leaving the free Basutu in the narrow strip between the Caledon and Highlands, the capital sitting on Maseru. Despite the losses, Moshoeshoe managed to preserve his kingdom, finally dying in 1870 in his 80s. Unfortunately, soon afterwards, in 1871, the Cape Colony did end up annexing Lesotho, ending the story. But not for long! The Basutu didn't like being under British rule, and they rebelled when the British tried to take their guns, God bless, and they defeated the British in the Basutu Gun War in 1881. As such, in 1884, the Cape disannexed Lesotho, and a new colony was established, Basutoland. You'll notice the British had the fun habit of adding land to the name of a native people's territory in Africa. So, a quick aside on British colonial politics, as it'll be helpful in the future. A crown colony was formally under the rule of the British Crown, represented by a governor. A self-governing colony had a representative body, a council, a parliament, a house, that could pass laws. Britain got scared of giving their colonies self-rule after 13 of them decided to rebel in 1776. But gradually warmed back up to the idea, first with Canada and then other places. 4 such colonies were in southern Africa: the Cape, 1872, Natal, 1893, Transvaal, 1906, and Orange River, 1907. When South Africa was formed in 1910, the governorships were abolished in favor of one governor general. And I should have mentioned this in the previous episode. We already talked about protectorates, but Basotho land was a crown colony that acted like a protectorate. It was administered not by a governor appointed by the crown, but by a resident commissioner by the governor of Cape Colony, later the Governor General of South Africa, who was also High Commissioner. This was likely an artifact of Lesotho's earlier protectorate status. The king, now Letsie I, continued to represent his people and perform ceremonial functions, but was sidelined politically by the British. British rule brought economic growth and integration with the greater imperial market. A railroad was built in 1905, and Basotho men went to work on the farms and in the mines of the Orange Free State province. However, Basotho land did not achieve self-government for the longest time, a privilege originally reserved for white settler colonies. Despite this, chiefs largely remained the heads of their local communities. When Basotho land was created in 1884, it served as a buffer between the Cape and the Boers, and an outpost in the interior of South Africa. The Xhosa and Zulu were still independent, and it didn't look too out of place. The 1902 annexation of the Boer republics and subsequent South African Union left Basotho land as a quaint relic of an earlier geopolitical landscape, a little enclave surrounded completely by South Africa. However, its separate status preserved it from the worst abuses of South Africa and apartheid. I mentioned the concept of Greater South Africa last time, and it will come up as we spend the rest of our time in the region. The scheme hinged on the incorporation of Southern Rhodesia into South Africa, which failed. It depended on this because the architect of Greater South Africa was Jan Smuts, a military and statesman. Smuts was a Cape Afrikaner who fought against the British in the Second Boer War. Despite this, Smuts admired British culture and civilization, and became a proponent of South African unionism and British imperialism. When he became Prime Minister in 1919, he started negotiations to begin unifying the British possessions south of the Zambezi. The failure of the Southern Rhodesia referendum troubled the British, because that colony would have been a useful counterweight to Afrikaner nationalism that always threatened British control in the Union. Pro-British Smuts was soon replaced in 1924 with the pro-Afrikaner Barry Hertzog, who laid some of the groundwork for apartheid. This was enough to convince the British that South Africa should not be strengthened with the High Commission territories of Bechuanaland, Swaziland, and Basotholand. Had the scheme gone forward, Basotholand would undoubtedly have been annexed to the Orange Free State province. All hope for this died finally in 1948 with the National Party's election. The great devastation of the Second World War left the colonial empires of Europe untenable in the new post-war climate. Pressure from their colonies, the UN, and the United States and Soviet Union led to decolonization. This was a complex process that occurred differently even within Africa. It was fairly peaceful in Basotholand. The colony was finally granted self-rule in 1959 and became independent of the British in 1966, renaming itself back to the Kingdom of Lesotho. Government started off fairly democratic, but by 1970 devolved into dictatorship. Lesotho also had disagreements with apartheid South Africa, understandably, but the latter's decision to close the border was a problem when they were Lesotho's only neighbor. 1986 saw a military coup. In 1990, the king was deposed. 1993, democracy returned, and soon the king restored, but things didn't calm down in Lesotho until the 2000s. But by then, Lesotho settled into one of the most democratic countries in Africa. Almost the entire population is ethnic Basotho, making it one of the most homogeneous countries in the world. I did look it up. I was curious. There is a movement in Lesotho to reincorporate their Basotho kinsmen in South Africa into their country. It's not very big, but it's there. Unfortunately, over half of Lesotho's people live in poverty, and the majority live on subsistence agriculture, as they have for over 1,000 years. Lesotho also has one of the highest HIV rates per capita. However, Lesotho has one of the highest literacy rates in Africa and benefits from South Africa's much larger economy, pegging its currency, the loti, to the South African rand. A project is underway to beef up Lesotho with hydroelectric dams, which, when complete, will generate a surplus of energy for the country. It's also a very pretty place, with abundant wildlife. This video went on a little longer than I intended, but I don't want any country to feel left out. Next time, we'll move on to the second of the 3 former British High Commission territories, Swaziland, or as it's known today, Eswatini. Until next time, thank you for watching.